to this Sunday because I was not focused on what is worth saying. But I know what is worth saying today, which is America still a light to the nations? Is America still a light to the nations? Is the topic for today's God Talk. Again, if you care to join the conversation, there's a chat line both on YouTube and Twitter, and you can make your comments as I go along. Why would I choose that as a topic when I was so ambivalent about doing this? God Talk, is America still a light to the nations? It's a simple question. So, the first thing that comes to mind is the Olympics, which the world is by and large paying attention to. I myself was watching some of the Olympic events on television today, live events. Yesterday, I watched women's judo, which I enjoyed it enormously because it's a gentle sport where they don't bash each other's head in like in the UFC, which is, we all like to watch it, but you have to ask yourself, what are we encouraging in each other? To beat each other up into a pulp? So then I watched the men's boxing this morning and I turned it off because, again, it's fundamentally a blood sport. And I realized mankind has evolved to the point of taking his instincts of murder and homicide and converting them into sports, which is a good thing. It's a very civilized thing, which the Greeks certainly exemplified with the original Olympics. And then we come to the Olympics themselves, where the first lady is there. That would be Jill Biden, the great Dr. Biden, the sociologist of some sort, who has never met let us say, someone who hates America she didn't love. She glorified everything anti-American possible. So now she's at the Olympics. I'm not blaming her for this. And she's in the rearview mirror anyway, by and large, although I'm not so sure that Kamala Harris will be the nominee, nor Donald Trump, and I'll go into that in a minute. I know you say, what, are you crazy? Well, maybe I'm crazy. Maybe I'm not crazy. And we see the opening ceremony of the Olympics, the most degenerate, disgusting, sick, perverted opening in history, which I call the Translympics. Even Muslims don't mock Jesus. I put on Twitter when we saw this. Translympics, the death of the West, where the Olympics opening ceremony openly mocked Jesus' Last Supper, as drag queens dressed as women play the role of disciples while a plus-size woman appears in the middle, symbolizing Jesus wearing a giant crown. Now, we know Kamala would approve of this. It was demonic. And what's interesting to me is the day before this, and I don't know where these things come from within me, I had put this up late at night the night before. As Western civil men were taught to channel their killer instincts into sports, uncivil Islamist barbarians have been taught to kill, burn, and rape, just like their ancestors. Now, hold on now. I didn't say all Muslims. I said uncivil Islamist barbarians. The next day, we see the death of the West, where the Olympics opening ceremony spits in the face of Jesus and steps on 1 billion Christians around the world, which is astounding. The opening ceremony recreating the Last Supper with drag queens. And instead of objecting to this, First Lady Biden is there and we haven't heard from her. And that's why when I woke up today, I spent about 2 hours studying something to do with health, which is tyramine and blood pressure, tyramine and headaches, tyramine and foods. Remember, I'm a trained doctorate. I'm trained in the field of nutrition and epidemiology. I used to write health books many years ago, and I can't say I've gotten rusty. I've always been reading about health and such. But I myself have been trying to heal myself by restudying things that I thought I knew, which I didn't completely know, because knowledge in any field is never complete, never. And the day you think you know everything, you know very little. So I spent hours this morning studying tyramine and blood pressure, and I found that I was eating foods that were terrible for me. Even I, And there's a message in this. Even I, who thinks he's such a great expert in the field of nutrition and health, didn't know that he was eating, meaning I was eating, switching from first to third and back again. I was eating foods that were harming me. I kind of knew it while I was doing it, and I didn't care at a certain point. I just said, to hell with it. I don't care anymore. But, I don't want to feel bad. And then we look at the spiritual side of nature, our natures, and I say to myself, the same thing is going on in the West. We're not just eating the wrong foods and getting sick. We are taking in the wrong images. We are taking in the wrong music. We are taking in the wrong ideas. And we are spitting out filth and degeneracy to the world. And I said, well, I don't know. I mean, does that mean we're no longer a light unto the nations? I would say America is no longer a light to the nations. We have become a night to the nations, not a light to the nations. And you can spell night in two different ways. Of course, the first word is N-I-G-H-T. We are a night to the nations. We're spreading darkness because of the perverts in Hollywood and the media, the perverts. We're spreading darkness, not light to the nations. Filth, garbage, filth of the worst kind. But we're also a night to the nations, K-N-I-G-H-T, with our all-powerful military. And are we using this military to its best advantage? Are we using this military to spread a light to the nations? Or we're just using this night, calling our military, for other reasons? I'll let you figure that one out. Depends upon where in the world and when. We're so past destroying Hitler that we can no longer sit and say, well, we defeated Hitler and saved the world from 1,000 years of darkness, which certainly was true. But are we doing this today? I can't answer that question. It's too big a question for me to answer. I can only ask this question at this time. So I say to myself this morning, it's Sunday morning, and people want me to do God Talk. They're asking me to do it on Twitter, and I have nothing to say to them. And the thought came to my mind, the Bedouin saying that I learned many years ago, which is that if you cannot improve upon the silence of the desert, do not speak. If you cannot improve upon the silence of the desert, do not speak. So I said, well, maybe I should just turn on the camera and the microphone and put up that sign on the chair which says that, and say nothing for 30 minutes and see what happens. It's an idea. Okay, but I didn't do that because I've been given a voice, a brain, and a corporal body in this time for a reason. And I do believe that one of the reasons God has kept me on this earth so long is to try to be some light to the people who believe that I have a touch of the prophetic within me. That's quite a complex statement. It doesn't say I am a prophet, nor does it say I'm not a prophet. I think there's a prophet within all men. But I don't want to get too generic right now. I want to stick to the question I raised, which is, I had to write it down. Sometimes I write it down to think through what I'm going to say. God Talk, is America still a light to the nations? Well, I don't think so. I think we've long ceased being a light to the nations. Can we individually remain a light to ourselves? And if we're a father or a mother, a light to our children? That's about all we can do. Tend your own garden at this point. I don't think we need to worry about the world when a world is crumbling around us. We see this decay. We see this destruction coming from the highest levels of our society. And we have to say to ourselves, well, we can't control that. What can we control? We control how we behave, what we project to the world. That's about all we can do. It's that simple. So again, I can go back to the Olympics and harp on it over and over again and how disgusting it was to 1 billion Christians, these filthy, degenerate scum of the earth, think that it would not offend 1 billion Christians when they mocked Jesus and the Last Supper. Would they dare mock Muhammad and Islam at the Olympics? I don't even have to answer the question. We know who they are. We know who our enemy is. And I could switch this now to the choice between Harris, who destroyed California, and we're told she'll save America. I mean, she was Attorney General, U.S. Senator, and far left anti police DA. We know what she will do. She and the husband of hers will do what they did last 2 weeks ago, inviting the same lunatics into the White House. They'll invite them into your brain if she wins. However, I'm not so sure that she's going to be the final candidate, nor am I sure Trump will be the final candidate. I know that's an alarming statement to many of you. I don't claim to have prophetic knowledge, nor do I claim to have any knowledge of such a thing, but I have thoughts on such a thing. And let me remind you of something historically. I was going through my notes today. For some reason, this fell out. Where I pulled it out. I don't know where this came from. It's a note I made to myself, which I'm going to read to you right now. Even the New York Times got 1967-68 wrong. A New Year's Eve story appeared that declared Nelson Rockefeller to be the only candidate whom Republican officials believed would beat President Lyndon Johnson. But LBJ was so unpopular that he dropped out of the race while Rockefeller stalled and launched a late failed campaign. Nixon took office in 1969. That was an unexpected result of the time. I believe that there are similarities to today. The Democrats have launched an absolutely failed, unpopular candidate, spending hundreds of millions of dollars telling us how wonderful she is. And I don't believe she's going to be the final Democrat candidate. And I'm not so sure that Trump, I hope he will be. I'm not so sure that they won't try again. Let me leave it at that. They took their best shot, or did they? They took a shot. Was it their best shot? Is it their only shot? I had a dream the other night of a huge airplane with U.S. Air Force markings filled with passengers who were not military but civilians. And in the midst of the flight, its right wing detached for all to watch, and the wing dropped to the earth. And all aboard died, even though the pilots tried to save the plane. I think the symbolism of it is very clear. Huge airplane with U.S. Air Force markings had its right wing detached, and all aboard died because I said a bird needs two wings to fly. I said that in radio days back in the 90s, a bird needs two wings to fly. And basically, this administration and the vermin in the media are trying to detach all things conservative, meaning family-oriented, God-oriented, from the nation that we all live in, and turn us into what? A world where the men and women who survive will grow up to love their servitude and will never dream of revolution. That reminds me of what's going on in this country amongst the Democrat socialists. It reminded me of Dostoevsky, as Huxley wrote that in the end, quote, people will lay their freedom at our feet. That's the rulers, Moloch. People will lay their freedom at our feet and say to us, make us your slaves, but feed us. In this society and in ours, people are comfortable handing over freedom to people in power in exchange for safety and stability. And in this exchange, people learn to love their servitude, choosing it over any dreams of revolution. And so that is how totalitarian control originates. Huxley again wrote, a really efficient totalitarian state would be one in which the all-powerful executive of political bosses and their army of managers control a population of slaves who do not have to be coerced because they love their servitude. Again, Huxley harkens back to the idea of slaves loving their servitude. Once again, if they trade their freedom for stability and are vulnerable to mind manipulation of their society, people quickly morph into slavery or are held to their servitude, not by force, but by a love of their position and the stability it provides. And so I ask, what are we on the verge of? Slavery or freedom? Is America still a light unto the nations? We have a society run by the sickest people in the history of the world, from Hollywood to Washington. We have trickle-down tyranny of the slimmest minority. Remember, Rome collapsed in the 3rd century owing to the empire decaying socially and disintegrating morally. Never forget that. What happened then was the barbarians invaded and broke the empire in two. We are being invaded from the southern border. They are barbarians. I don't care what anyone says to me. They're uneducated. They're barbarians. And this is akin to the 3rd century collapse of the Roman Empire. And we knew that Biden was the equivalent of a senile emperor, a Caesar. So I've given you the prologue to God Talk, as America is still a light to the nations. And maybe I've given you the whole talk. Maybe there's nothing more I need to say for today. It's a thought of saving by thinking, because I've always felt that we can always think our way out of our abyss. I turn now to Genesis 19:24, which I found in a little book called the Bible, which appeared in a little book called God, Faith, and Reason by yours truly. Still one of my most important books. And I want to read to you Genesis 19:24. Because the world is falling apart right now. It looks to me like there's going to be a major blowout in the Middle East. Lebanon is blowing up. Multiple countries have urged citizens to leave Lebanon. Yeah, now again, the Middle East. France, Norway, Belgium, Sweden, Saudi Arabia, Canada, Germany, Netherlands, Austria, Switzerland, Ireland, Kuwait, Jordan, and the UK have called on their citizens to leave Lebanon immediately due to escalating war tensions in the region. It looks like a major conflict is about to blow up because Israel's entering Lebanon to counter the killing of their children from a rocket barrage into Israel. That was left out of this story. Commercial flights, as we speak, are still operational, allowing for the immediate evacuation of foreign nationals, but they're told to get the hell out of Lebanon. The cedars of Lebanon, the once important Lebanon. And it reminds me of Genesis 19:24. Then the Lord caused to rain upon Sodom and upon Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven, and he overthrew those cities and all the plain and all the inhabitants of the cities and that which grew upon the ground. But his wife looked back from behind him, and she became a pillar of salt. Once again, I have chills up my spine and my whole back when I read that to you. But his wife looked back from behind him, and she became a pillar of salt. My friends, we are there. It's fire and brimstone time. We don't know how this ends. We only know how it begins. Do we turn to the Bible at this time? What do we turn to right now at this time? I don't have an answer to that question. Is America a light to the nations? No, it is not. In these years, under this despotic socialist administration run by Bernie Sanders and the girls behind him, the so-called squad, and their puppet was Biden all along. It was Bernie Sanders who was running this country, a naked communist Bolshevik, whatever you want to call him. A lifetime of Bolshevism. He finally got what he wanted, a puppet in the White House. And so now we are on the verge of saying, well, okay, we're going to elect Trump and he's going to save the world. Well, even if he gets to the finish line, which is not clear because the finish line is quite a long way from now, and the establishment try to kill him. It doesn't mean they won't try again with poison or with an airplane crash. Write it down because that was my dream. I didn't even want to say it, but I just did. Even if Trump gets to the finish line, and even if Trump wins, do you think he can save America and the world? I don't think so. Because remember, he has to get his bills through Congress. Oh, there's a lot that presidents can do through executive order, like this creature in the White House has done, destroying our borders, language, and culture. That comes down to the nation itself is defined by its borders, language, and culture. Every nation on earth knows that. You look at the Olympics, every contestant is representing their nation. So you say nation has an identity. So every nation's identity is defined by what? Borders, language, and culture. No one has said it better than me. And I'm taking credit for it again and again and again, because those are the only three things that matter in this election. Trump should be talking only about borders, language, and culture, not about himself. Only about borders, language, and culture, nothing else, not about himself. But he's not doing that. Once again, I see it happening all over again. He's surrounded by very bad advisors. Terrible. They're doing it again. But I don't want to talk about him either. Hezbollah is threatening Israel with genocide. Iran's proxy armies are saying it has a right to massacre Israelis with impunity. And if Israel defends its people, it will try to kill everyone in Israel. The world is telling Israel to restrain itself. Hezbollah MP says Israel will come to an end if it wages war in Lebanon. So once again, we're in sort of biblical times. I will remind you that in the Golan Heights, 12 Jewish children were murdered by a rocket fired by Hezbollah into a playground. It was a place in the Golan called Majdal Sham. Of course, they blamed the Jews for dying. And that's the way it is. So here in this country, we have a creature of the San Francisco criminal machine, Harris, loved by the far left communist regime in America, like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. And Elizabeth Warren is on TV saying that Harris, the hologram Harris is a hologram. She's not even a real person in the sense that she represents forces and powers, will grant citizenship to the 15 million illegals that she let in as border czar. So what she did to California, she'd like to do to the country. Granting amnesty to the 12 to 15 million that she let in. Okay. That's not okay. Not okay at all. It's terrible. Borders, language, and culture will disappear. So I come back to where I began and where I will conclude. Longer is not better. Shorter is not better. It's when you're through, you're through. I asked the question, God talk, is America still a light to the nations? I'll let you decide for yourself if teaching children to switch their genders and spitting in the face of 1 billion Christians at the Olympics, which certainly has a lot to do with America giving a wink and a nod, if that's an example of a light to the nations, or is it a darkness to the nations and a death to the nations? Maybe I should conclude with history. I think I'll conclude with history. Give me a moment. I'm back with you. I want to talk with you for a moment about the great days of the Arabs and how Islam took over most of the world, how it was done not through the teachings of love, but through killing, raping, and burning. If you don't know this, you know nothing. It's a story of one of the greatest conquests in the history of the human race. And it began at a certain time in history. The Byzantine army was smashed at the Battle of the Yarmouk, a tributary of the Jordan River in 634. The Emperor Heraclius, who was exhausted by the Persian War, saw his new conquests in Syria, Damascus, Palmyra, Antioch, Jerusalem, and the rest fall almost without resistance to the invading Muslims. Large elements in these countries went over to the Arabs and converted to Islam. And then the marauding armies of the Muslims turned east. The Persians, meaning the Iranians, were not Muslims. They had a great general in Rustam. They had a great force of elephants. And for 3 days, they fought the Arabs at Qadisiyah. But in 637, Persia fell, and they ran. The conquest of all Persia followed, and the Muslim empire pushed far into western Turkestan and eastward until it met the Chinese. Egypt fell almost without resistance to the new conquerors, who had a fanatical belief in the sufficiency of their one book, the Quran, and they burnt the book copying industry of Alexandria to the ground. Sound familiar to you? Book burning? And then the tide of Muslim invasion and conquest poured along the north coast of Africa to the Straits of Gibraltar and Spain. Spain was invaded in 710. They reached the Pyrenees Mountains in the year 720. In 732, the Arabs advanced to the center of France, but here it was stopped for good at the Battle of Poitiers and thrust back as far as the Pyrenees again. They were stopped by the gladiators, the Christian gladiators in France and in Spain. But in conquering Egypt, the Muslims gained a great ship-going fleet. And then for a time, it looked as though they would take Constantinople. They conducted repeated sea attacks between 672 and 718. But the great city held out against them. So I can tell you more about this, but it's a long history lesson. And our interest here lies not with the story of the political conquest of these peoples and the disintegration of these nations under the Muslim hordes, but with its effect upon the human mind and upon the general destinies of the human beings. It was not all negative. Because in time, the intolerant self-sufficiency of the early days of faith, which made the Quran seem the only possible book, was eventually dropped. And learning then sprang up everywhere in the footsteps of the Arab conquerors. And by the 8th century, there was an educational organization throughout the whole Arabized world. And in the 9th century, learned men in the schools of Cordoba, Spain, were corresponding with learned men in Cairo, Baghdad, Bokhara, and Samarkand. The Jewish mind then assimilated very readily with the Arab mind, and for a time the two Semitic races worked together through the medium of Arabic. And that is how it emerged, and that's how it went. And that is how the systematic accumulation and criticism of facts, which was first begun by the Greeks, was resumed in this astonishing renaissance of the Semitic world. The seat of Aristotle and the Museum of Alexandria that had lain so long inactive and neglected now germinated and began to grow towards fruition. And soon very great advances were made in mathematical, medical, and physical science. The clumsy Roman numerals were ousted by the Arabic figures we use to this very day. And the zero sign was first employed. The very name algebra is Arabic. So is the word chemistry. The names of such stars as Algol, Aldebaran, and Bootes preserve the traces of Arab conquests in the heavens. Their philosophy was destined to reanimate the medieval philosophy of France and Italy and the whole Christian world. The Arab experimental chemists were called alchemists, and they were still barbaric in spirit, and they kept their methods and results secret as far as possible. They realized from the very beginning what enormous advantages their possible discoveries might give them and what far-reaching consequences they might have on human life. The early Arab alchemists came upon many metallurgical and technical devices of the utmost value, alloys and dyes, distilling, tinctures and essences, optical glass. But the two chief ends they sought in vain. One was the Philosopher's Stone, a means of changing the metallic elements one into another and so getting a control of artificial gold. And the other was the elixir vitae, a stimulant that would revivify age and prolong life indefinitely. They couldn't find it. And then eventually these Arab alchemists spread into the Christian world, and the fascination of their inquiries then spread. Very gradually, the activities of these alchemists became more social and cooperative. They found it profitable to exchange and compare ideas. And eventually, the alchemists became the first of the experimental philosophers. The old alchemists sought the philosopher's stone, which was to transmute base metals to gold, and an elixir of immortality. Instead, they found the methods of modern experimental science, which promote and promise, in the end, to give man illimitable power over the world and over his own destiny. And I pray, as I speak with you today, that this great nation, America, which has given the world so much in terms of advances in civilization, in science, and in medicine, for example, does again one day become a light to the nations. I'm Michael Savage. Thank you for being with us today on Twitter and on YouTube. And I'll ask you again, is America still a light to the nations with what we see going on with our borders, language, and culture? Can we once again become a light to the nations? Can we save our borders and our language and our culture from the barbarians who have been ushered in? Thank you for listening. May God be with all of us. And I appreciate it if you subscribe, because I do these things only when I really have something to say. Otherwise, I am as silent as the wind. I live in silence most of the time. I find talk to be very disturbing. Most thought is very disturbing to me. Other thoughts, they rattle my brain. Especially talk is rattling to my brain. I prefer the company of silence.